My name is Isabella Harris. I am 29 years old and I work as a registered nurse at a regional hospital just outside the city. The night my mother told me I would be fine in the basement, I had just come home from a 12-hour shift that started before sunrise and ended well after dark. One of my patients coded twice before we stabilized him, and another cried quietly while I held her hand because she was afraid to sleep. My scrub still smelled like antiseptic and bleach. My feet ached, my shoulders burned, and my head felt heavy in that dull way it always did after too many alarms and not enough rest. All I wanted was my bed and silence. Instead, I walked into a decision that had already been made without me. I was standing in the hallway, my shoes still on, when my mother Linda put her hand flat against my bedroom door. She didn't look at me when she spoke. She said it calmly, like she was reading something off a list. "You'll be fine in the basement. Your brother needs the room." There was no question mark in her voice. She turned the knob and pushed the door open as if she were moving furniture, not a person. Inside, my room was already half dismantled. My bed frame leaned against the wall. My lamp was unplugged. A box with my winter clothes sat open on the floor, like someone had started packing my life and then lost interest. Behind her, my younger brother Ryan stood in the doorway, arms crossed, one foot hooked around the leg of the desk I used after night shifts to study and decompress. He smiled at me small and tight and said, "It'll be quieter down there anyway." I looked at my mother. I looked at him. I looked at the room I paid for every month. All I said was, "Okay." I bent down, grabbed my backpack, my phone charger, and the hoodie I wore when the house felt cold, and I walked past them toward the basement door. They thought my silence meant agreement. What it really meant was that something inside me finally stopped trying. The basement smelled like damp concrete and old detergent. The light flickered when I pulled the cord, casting a weak yellow glow over the washer, the dryer, and the narrow strip of floor they had cleared for me. An old twin mattress sat directly on the concrete. A folding chair leaned against the wall, its metal legs uneven. This was where they thought I belonged. I set my things down and stood there for a moment, listening to the hum of the machines. My chest felt tight, but not with anger, with recognition. I had lived in that house since my father died, telling myself it made sense. I worked nights. I helped with bills. I drove my mother to appointments and filled out paperwork she said made her anxious. I covered gaps without naming them. I paid things quietly so no one had to feel uncomfortable. Standing there, I realized no one had asked how my shift went. No one had asked if I was okay. No one had considered what it meant to push the person funding half the house into the coldest, lowest room. Upstairs, I could hear Ryan laughing, already settling in, already comfortable. My mother's voice floated down the stairs, lighter, relieved, like a problem had been solved. I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the concrete floor. I thought about the years I had spent caring for strangers, noticing small changes intervening before things collapsed. I thought about how my family relied on me the same way without the respect that came with it. They trusted that I would always handle it. They trusted that I would bend. When I said okay, they thought I would adapt again. They didn't know that the part of me that kept absorbing everything had finally gone quiet. That night, I lay awake listening to the house settle above me. Pipes knocked. Floorboards creaked. Ryan paced back and forth, probably rearranging what used to be my room. I didn't cry. I didn't plan. I just felt a strange clarity settle in. The basement wasn't the problem. It was the proof. And by the next morning, they were going to learn what happened when the person holding everything together stopped doing it. I didn't sleep much that night, not because the basement was uncomfortable, but because my thoughts refused to settle. Every sound felt amplified down there, the washer clicking the pipes, knocking the faint vibration of footsteps overhead as Ryan moved around in the room that had been mine only hours earlier. I lay on the thin mattress, staring at the exposed beams, replaying my mother's voice in my head, calm and certain, as if she'd announced a weather forecast instead of uprooting her daughter. If you've ever been the one your family depends on without ever really acknowledging it, you know the shift I'm describing. It's the moment when anger drains out and something colder replaces it. Not numbness, but clarity. For years, I'd told myself this was normal. This was what being a good daughter looked like after my father died. My mother liked to say we were close, that we shared everything, that we looked out for each other. What she meant was that I shared my time, my money, my energy, and my silence. while everyone else accepted it as the natural order of things. Lying there, I thought about how many nights I'd come home from the hospital exhausted and still ended up fixing the Wi-Fi resetting passwords or calling customer service because my mother said she didn't have the patience for it. I thought about how often I'd transferred money without comment when she said she was a little short this month, how often I'd told myself it wasn't a big deal because I was stable, because my job was secure, because I could handle it. My work in healthcare was always described that way. Stable, reliable, like it was something that made my life easier instead of something that demanded my body, my sleep, and my emotions on a daily basis. Ryan's half-formed plans, on the other hand, were treated like fragile things that needed constant protection. He was creative. He was figuring himself out. He needed support. No one ever worried about protecting me. They worried about what would happen if I stopped showing up. That night, I realized how clearly the roles had been written. I was the one who adapted. He was the one who expanded. I rolled onto my side and checked the time on my phone. Just after 2 in the morning. In a few hours, I'd be back at the hospital, moving from room to room, monitoring vitals, noticing subtle changes before alarms went off. Somewhere between the hum of the machines in the basement and the memory of the beeping monitors at work, it clicked that my family trusted me the same way my patients did, but without the respect that came with professional boundaries. They trusted that I would fix things because I always had not, because they valued what it cost me. If you're listening to this because you've ever wondered what would happen if you stopped fixing everything, stay with me. Because by the next morning, I finally found out. I woke up before my alarm showered in the small basement bathroom and got dressed without going upstairs. As I pulled on my scrubs, I felt oddly calm, like a decision had already been made somewhere deeper than fear. On my way out, I paused at the bottom of the stairs and listened to the house. It was quiet. Everyone was still asleep, unaware that something essential was already shifting. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a message. I walked out the door, drove the familiar route to work, parked in the same spot, and badge swiped into the building like I always did. From the outside, nothing about my life had changed yet. Inside, I had already stepped out of the role they depended on without ever acknowledging it. That was when the clock started ticking, even though they had no idea. Growing up, our house always looked ordinary from the outside, the kind of place people passed without a second glance. A small yard, a porch light that stayed on all night, a single mother who worked hard, and 2 kids who seemed fine. Inside, everything was organized around an unspoken hierarchy that shaped who mattered most. After my father died, my mother liked to tell people we became a team. What she really meant was that everyone took on a role, and mine was to make sure nothing ever collapsed. I learned that before I was old enough to question it. When I was 13, I learned how to cook simple meals because my mother worked late. When I was 15, I learned how to read bills and check balances because she said money stressed her out. When I was 17, I learned how to stay quiet when I was tired because someone else always needed something more urgently. Ryan was younger, softer in her eyes, the child she worried about. If he forgot to do something, it was because he was overwhelmed. If I forgot, it was because I wasn't trying hard enough. When I brought home good grades, my mother nodded and said she wasn't surprised. When Ryan barely passed a class, she told relatives how proud she was that he tried. Over time, that difference stopped feeling accidental and started feeling structural. By the time I entered nursing school, it was already understood that my path was solid and predictable, that my effort would turn into income, that my life would be useful. I commuted from home to save money, telling myself it was practical. I worked part-time and picked up extra shifts, telling myself it was temporary. Ryan drifted. He switched majors. He took breaks. Each change was framed as growth. Each delay was framed as necessary. My mother talked about my career like it was a safety net, something that existed to catch the rest of us. She called it stable. She called it reliable. She never called it exhausting. Ryan's plans were always discussed carefully, like they might break if questioned too closely. If he quit a job, it was because the manager didn't see his potential. If I came home drained, it was because that was part of the job I chose. I remember one night when the car broke down. I had just finished a double shift and found my mother and Ryan arguing in the driveway. Before anyone asked, I pulled out my phone and paid for the tow. My mother hugged me and said she didn't know what she would do without me. Ryan thanked me and went inside. That moment felt good at the time. It felt like being essential. I didn't realize it was teaching them something dangerous. It taught them that I would always step in, that I would always absorb the hit. Over the years, my contributions became background noise. Bills were paid, groceries appeared, problems disappeared quietly. My mother started saying Isabella will handle it without looking at me. And I did because it felt easier than fighting, because saying no felt like betrayal, because I had learned that my value in that house came from how much I could carry without complaint. That was why the basement hurt in a way I couldn't ignore. It wasn't the first time I'd been pushed aside, just the first time it was undeniable. My space, my time, my energy had always been considered flexible. When my mother decided Ryan needed my room, she wasn't making a sudden choice. She was following a pattern she had relied on for years. The basement was simply the physical proof of something that had always existed. It just took being moved underground for me to finally see it clearly. I learned quickly that my work in healthcare was respected everywhere except inside my own home. At the hospital, people listened when I spoke. Doctors asked for my assessment. Patients trusted me with their fear. At home, my job was reduced to a convenient explanation for why I should always be available. My mother talked about nursing like it was something I did between other responsibilities, not the reason our lights stayed on. She called it steady and predictable, the kind of work that made life easier. She never mentioned the nights I came home shaking after losing someone, or the mornings I sat in my car for 10 minutes before going inside because I needed to breathe. When I talked about a hard shift, she nodded politely and changed the subject to Ryan. He was always tired, always stressed, always one small opportunity away from figuring things out. My exhaustion was expected. His was concerning. When I picked up extra shifts to cover shortages, my mother said it was good I had that option. When Ryan slept through another interview, she said he needed time. Over the years, I stopped explaining what my job actually required because it didn't seem to matter. It was easier to let them believe I had energy to spare. During the pandemic, when the hospital was overwhelmed, I worked back-to-back shifts and came home numb. My mother thanked me for being careful and then asked if I could add more groceries to the delivery order. Ryan complained about being bored and stuck inside. I listened, nodding, too tired to point out the obvious difference. In that house, my profession wasn't seen as service or skill. It was seen as insurance. Something dependable that could be leaned on without asking. My mother liked to say I was lucky I had a job that couldn't disappear. She said it like a compliment, but it always felt like a justification. Lucky meant I could cover things. Lucky meant I could adapt. Lucky meant my boundaries were optional. Ryan, on the other hand, was described as misunderstood. His ambitions were fragile, deserving of patience. When he talked about starting something new, my mother leaned in attentive, careful not to discourage him. When I talked about taking a certification course or changing units, she warned me not to risk stability. "Don't rock the boat," she said. "We need you where you are." That phrase followed me for years. We need you where you are. It wasn't about my happiness or growth. It was about keeping the system intact. My career in healthcare made me useful, not valued. It taught me how to function under pressure, how to prioritize others, how to ignore my own discomfort until later. Those skills translated perfectly into the role my family assigned me. I handled emergencies calmly. I solved problems quietly. I put my needs last. At work, that discipline was acknowledged. At home, it was exploited. When my mother decided Ryan needed my room to focus, she justified it by saying I worked odd hours anyway. I wasn't home much. I could make do. The implication was clear. My presence was flexible. His comfort was not. Standing in the basement that night, I understood how deeply that belief ran. They didn't see pushing me down there as cruel. They saw it as practical. They believed I would be fine because I always had been. What they didn't understand was that the same discipline that kept me steady during 12-hour shifts was the discipline that allowed me to stop explaining myself. In healthcare, we're taught to recognize patterns before they become emergencies. We're taught that ignoring warning signs doesn't make them disappear. It just makes the outcome worse. Looking back, the way my work was minimized at home was one of those signs. It was the quiet permission they gave themselves to take more and more. assuming I would never step away. The difference between how my mother spoke about Ryan and how she spoke about me became impossible to ignore once I was an adult living under the same roof. He was 26 and still described as finding himself. I was 29 and described as settled, as if my life were already finished and neatly filed away. When Ryan announced he wanted to take a break from school, my mother told him that not everyone's path was linear and that he shouldn't rush greatness. When I mentioned being tired or overwhelmed, she reminded me that I had chosen a stable career and that stability came with responsibility. The message was subtle but constant. Ryan was protected from pressure. I was built to absorb it. At family gatherings, relatives asked Ryan what he was working on lately, their voices curious and encouraging. When they turned to me, they asked if I was still at the hospital, like they were checking a box. If I tried to explain what my job actually involved, someone would interrupt to say how lucky I was to have something secure. My accomplishments were treated like maintenance, his like potential. That imbalance followed us home. Ryan's messes were temporary, mine were character flaws. If he forgot to do dishes, it was because he was distracted. If I left a mug in the sink after a night shift, my mother sighed and said she wished I'd be more considerate. I learned to clean quietly to smooth things over before they became issues. Ryan learned that someone else would handle it. My mother framed this as fairness. She said I was older, more capable, better at managing things. She said Ryan was sensitive and needed space. What she never said out loud was that my competence made me convenient. The more reliable I became, the more was expected of me. When Ryan wanted to start a podcast, my mother lit up. She talked about his voice, his ideas, his future audience. She asked me if I could help him research equipment, maybe cover a few things until he got going. When I hesitated, she reminded me that I had a paycheck and he didn't yet. She said it like a temporary imbalance, not a pattern that had lasted years. I ordered the microphone. I paid for the software subscription. I told myself it was an investment in family harmony. Ryan recorded a few episodes and then lost interest. The equipment stayed in my room unused until the night my mother decided he needed my space. Looking back, that should have been obvious. Of course, the golden child would be given the room with the door and the light and the privacy. Of course, the responsible one would be told she could manage without. My mother didn't see it as choosing him over me. She saw it as allocating resources where they mattered most. That belief ran deep. Ryan mattered because he might become something extraordinary. I mattered because I already was something useful. I could be counted on. I could be moved. I could be diminished without complaint. There were moments when I almost believed it myself. When you're praised for being strong long enough, you start to confuse strength with silence. I remember standing in the kitchen one afternoon, exhausted after a string of night shifts, listening to my mother reassure Ryan that he didn't need to rush into anything. She said life wasn't a race. Then she turned to me and asked if I could pick up an extra shift because the electric bill was higher this month. The contrast was so sharp it almost felt like a joke. Ryan's time was protected. Mine was already spoken for. That dynamic shaped how we saw each other. Ryan grew comfortable taking. I grew practiced at giving. Neither of us questioned it because it was all we knew. By the time my mother pushed me into the basement, the roles were set. He expected the room. She expected my compliance, and I expected myself to swallow it. What none of them expected was that I had reached the limit of what being the responsible one could cost me. The basement didn't just take away my space. It stripped away the last excuse I had for pretending this was balanced. In that moment, I saw the truth clearly. Being the golden child meant never having to carry the weight. Being the responsible one meant carrying it until your hands were empty. The sacrifices didn't begin with the basement. They began so quietly that I convinced myself they were choices instead of concessions. When I first moved back home after finishing nursing school, it was supposed to be temporary. 6 months, maybe a year, just long enough to pay down loans and build a cushion. I told myself it was practical. My mother thanked me for being sensible. Ryan barely noticed, except to say it was nice having someone else around. The first bill I covered was the electric. My mother said her hours had been cut that month and asked if I could help just this once. I said yes without thinking. It felt natural. I had a paycheck. I had a job people called stable. The second was the internet. Ryan complained it was too slow for his classes, and my mother asked if I could upgrade the plan. It ended up on my card, then groceries, then gas, then the phone plan when she said combining lines would be cheaper for everyone. Each time I told myself it made sense. Each time I pushed aside the small voice that wondered why it always seemed to be me. My schedule bent around everyone else's needs. I worked nights and weekends, which meant I was home during the day when my mother needed rides or paperwork filled out. Ryan slept late, so I learned to be quiet to tiptoe to exist around him. After a 12-hour shift, I'd come home and still stop at the pharmacy because my mother forgot to refill a prescription. I didn't keep track at first. It felt petty to count. Family wasn't a transaction, I told myself, but the sacrifices stacked up anyway. I missed dinners with friends because I was tired or because something came up at home. I turned down a weekend trip because my mother didn't like being alone overnight. I picked up extra shifts not because I wanted to advance, but because I knew the money would be needed somewhere. My work in healthcare trained me to put others first, to prioritize urgency, to ignore my own discomfort until later. At home, that training worked against me. There was always something that felt more urgent than my rest. A bill due, a ride needed, a problem to solve. Ryan's needs were treated like emergencies even when they weren't. My exhaustion was treated like background noise. When I mentioned being tired, my mother reminded me that I was young and resilient. She said I could handle it. That phrase became a refrain. You can handle it. It sounded like confidence, but it functioned like permission. Permission to take more. Permission to ask without asking. Permission to assume I'd absorb whatever was dropped in my path. I began to notice how my sacrifices were framed differently than Ryan's. When he gave something up, it was praised. When I did, it was expected. If he worked a short-term job, my mother told him how proud she was. If I worked overtime, she asked if I could work more. The line between help and obligation blurred until I couldn't see it anymore. I stopped buying things for myself. New shoes could wait. A better mattress could wait. A class I wanted to take could wait. There was always something else that needed covering. I told myself I was being responsible. I told myself it would even out eventually. I didn't realize I was teaching them that my life was expandable, that my needs could be postponed indefinitely. The basement decision didn't come out of nowhere. It came from years of watching me adjust without complaint, from years of seeing me sacrifice quietly and still show up smiling. They believed I would make it work because I always had. What they didn't understand was that every sacrifice had a cost, even if I didn't invoice it. By the time I was told I'd be fine in the basement, I had already given more than I could afford. I just hadn't stopped to calculate it yet. The financial part of it crept in so slowly that by the time I noticed, it felt normal. There was no single conversation where my mother sat me down and asked me to support the household. It happened in fragments, in small, reasonable-sounding requests that stacked on top of each other until they formed something heavy. After the electric bill and the internet upgrade, there was the gas bill one winter, when prices spiked and my mother frowned at the statement like it had personally offended her. She said she would pay me back next month when things evened out. They never really did. Then there were the subscriptions. Netflix first because Ryan liked to watch documentaries for inspiration. Then Hulu because my mother said the news made her anxious and she wanted something lighter in the evenings. Spotify came next, bundled into the phone plan I had already put on my card because it was supposedly cheaper that way. Each charge was small enough to ignore on its own. Together, they became part of my baseline expenses. Groceries followed the same pattern. I started picking them up on my way home from work because it was easier than coordinating schedules. My mother would text me a list while I was on break at the hospital. Ryan would add things later, snacks and energy drinks, things I never bought for myself. I told myself it was fine. I was already there. It was more efficient. The problem was that efficiency always seemed to benefit everyone else. When my mother needed an Uber early in the morning because she didn't want to take the bus in the dark, I ordered it without thinking. When Ryan said his card wasn't working and he needed a ride across town, I drove him. When the insurance paperwork came in the mail, it landed in my hands because I understood it better. I didn't notice when the language shifted from "could you help" to "can you handle this?" Handle became the word attached to everything. Handle the bill. Handle the call. Handle the problem. My mother said it with relief, like she could finally breathe once it was off her plate. I told myself this was what families did, that everyone contributed in different ways. But the math was lopsided. My contribution was measurable, theirs was assumed. I started keeping a rough tally in my head, then in the Notes app on my phone when the unease wouldn't go away. Rent, I handed my mother each month. Utilities I covered when she said she was short. The upgraded internet plan. The phone bill. Subscriptions I'd forgotten I signed up for because everyone used them. Groceries. Takeout on nights when no one felt like cooking. Ubers. Small repairs. Each line looked harmless. Together they formed a pattern I couldn't unsee. The worst part was how invisible it all was. From the outside, it looked like my mother was managing just fine. Ryan talked about how hard things were, how uncertain the future felt, and everyone nodded sympathetically. No one looked at me and wondered how the lights stayed on. No one asked how much it cost me to keep things smooth. My mother framed it as family helping family. She said we were all struggling. I started to realize that struggle meant something different depending on who you were. For Ryan, it meant frustration and waiting. For my mother, it meant anxiety and complaint. For me, it meant paying and moving on. I didn't talk about it because I didn't want to seem bitter, because I didn't want to be accused of keeping score. But my body knew. I felt it in the way my chest tightened every time my card auto renewed another subscription, in the way my stomach dropped when a bill notification popped up before payday. I was bleeding money quietly so everyone else could pretend things were fine. The night I was told to move into the basement, I finally understood that the financial exploitation wasn't separate from the rest of it. It was the foundation. They could push me out of my room because they believed I would still pay. They could sell my comfort because they trusted my silence. The basement was humiliating, but the realization underneath it was worse. I wasn't just being inconvenienced. I was being used. And for the first time, instead of explaining it away, I let that truth settle. The money was only one layer of what I gave. The other was my time, the kind that never showed up on a statement but still drained me all the same. I became the default problem solver in ways that felt almost invisible until I stepped back and looked at them together. If the Wi-Fi dropped during one of Ryan's late-night gaming sessions, he stomped down the stairs and knocked on my door because he knew I'd fix it. If my mother couldn't log into her email or understand a message from the insurance company, she handed me her phone without asking. I fielded calls from pharmacies, utility companies, and customer service lines while sitting in my car after work, still in scrubs, listening to hold music instead of decompressing. On my days off, which were rarely restful to begin with, I ran errands that weren't mine. I picked up prescriptions, returned packages, waited for repair technicians, and filled out forms that made my mother nervous. Ryan treated my availability like a feature, not a favor. He'd call my name from across the house when something needed doing, confident I'd appear. If I hesitated, my mother reminded me that he was sensitive, that pushing him too hard would only discourage him. No one worried about discouraging me. I learned to move quietly to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to smooth over inconveniences so no one else had to feel them. After a long shift, when my feet ached and my head throbbed, I still found myself standing in the kitchen, listening to my mother vent about her day while Ryan scrolled on his phone. If I mentioned being tired, she smiled sympathetically and said, "I know, honey, but you're strong." Strong became another justification. Strong meant I could handle one more thing. Strong meant my exhaustion didn't count as much. At work, being dependable was praised. At home, it was exploited. I answered calls during dinner, during showers, during the few hours of sleep I tried to protect between shifts. My phone buzzing didn't feel optional. It felt like an alarm I was trained to respond to. When Ryan decided to test new equipment for his streaming setup, he did it late at night, loud and chaotic. If something went wrong, he blamed the internet, then looked at me. I'd get out of bed, reset the router, troubleshoot cables, all while reminding myself it was temporary. Everything was always temporary until it wasn't. My mother framed my involvement as help. She told friends how lucky she was to have a daughter who understood these things. What she didn't mention was how much of my life disappeared into managing theirs. The hospital taught me how to compartmentalize, how to push through fatigue, how to prioritize others even when my own reserves were low. Those skills made me excellent at my job. They also made me vulnerable at home. I didn't recognize burnout because it didn't look like collapse. It looked like competence stretched too thin. It looked like me functioning while quietly resenting the sound of my name being called. There were nights when I sat in my car after work, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house, trying to gather enough energy to walk inside. I knew the moment I opened the door, someone would need something. A question, a favor, a fix. The idea of rest felt abstract. My time wasn't my own. It belonged to whoever asked first. By the time my mother decided I'd be fine in the basement, I was already living at the bottom of the household hierarchy. The physical move just made it visible. Pushing me down there meant I was easier to access closer to the machines, further from comfort. It fit the role I'd been playing all along. What they didn't understand was that while I was trained to respond to alarms, I was also trained to recognize when a system was failing. And that night, listening to the hum of the washer and the distant noise upstairs, I finally acknowledged that the system I was part of was unsustainable. Ryan's entitlement didn't arrive all at once. It grew in the space my mother and I created for it, fed by reassurance and absence of consequence. By his mid-20s, he spoke about work like it was something that happened to other people. He had ideas instead, plans that changed every few months and were always described as promising. One week it was online courses, the next, it was content creation, then consulting, then something he heard about from a friend who swore it was the future. My mother listened to each new idea with the same careful enthusiasm, nodding, asking questions, telling him not to settle. When I asked practical questions like how he planned to support himself in the meantime, she shot me a look that said I was being negative. She said he didn't need pressure, he needed encouragement. Encouragement in our house usually came with my credit card attached. When Ryan decided he wanted to start streaming seriously, my mother treated it like a career announcement. She told relatives he was building something. She said he just needed the right setup. She asked me if I could help him research equipment because I was good at that kind of thing. The ask was framed as small. Just advice, just a little support until he got going. I knew how this worked, but I agreed anyway. I sent links, compared prices, explained what was necessary and what wasn't. Somehow the necessary list grew. A microphone, a camera, lighting, software subscriptions, a better desk. My mother said we could consider it an investment in his future. She reminded me that my job paid well and that this was family. I paid for the mic. I covered the first month of the software. I told myself it was temporary. Ryan streamed a few times. He talked into the microphone with confidence, convinced his audience would find him any day now. When technical issues came up, he yelled my name. When numbers didn't climb fast enough, he blamed the algorithm. When he lost interest, he didn't say anything at all. The equipment sat unused in my room, taking up space I paid for. My mother never asked if he planned to reimburse me. She never framed it as a loan. It was understood that I had helped. That was enough. Over time, Ryan stopped pretending his requests were favors. He assumed my availability. He assumed my resources. If he wanted something, he checked with my mother, not me. She would relay the request already softened, already decided. It became a pattern. He wanted upgrades. She wanted peace. I paid. The basement decision was the peak of that entitlement, but not the start. Giving him my room wasn't just about space. It was about prioritizing his comfort over my stability. My mother justified it by saying he needed a quiet place to focus. She said I worked odd hours anyway. She said I could sleep anywhere. The implication was clear. His potential required protection. My reality was flexible. When I tried to explain that I needed my room to rest after shifts, she waved it off. She said I was young. She said I could adapt. Ryan didn't argue. He didn't need to. The decision benefited him. He moved in quickly, setting up his equipment like it had always belonged there. He joked about the basement being cozy. He said it would build character. What struck me most was how little hesitation there was. No guilt. No pause. He had learned that taking didn't require asking. That lesson had been reinforced for years. Watching him settle into my space was like watching the final piece click into place. The golden child had been elevated, and the responsible one had been lowered exactly as the system demanded. Standing in the basement listening to him laugh upstairs, I felt something shift. It wasn't jealousy. It was understanding. Ryan's entitlement wasn't just his flaw. It was the result of choices made again and again, choices that taught him he could take without consequence. The basement made that truth unavoidable. They had taken my room because they believed I would still pay, still fix, still comply. They believed I was immovable. What they didn't know was that entitlement only works when someone agrees to carry it. And that night, without announcing it, I stopped. The room they took from me had never just been a bedroom. It was the only place in that house where I could close a door and exist without being immediately needed. After night shifts, it was where I slept, through daylight blackout curtains pulled tight, while the rest of the world moved on without me. It was where I studied for certifications, where I sat on the edge of the bed, replaying difficult cases, where I let myself feel the weight of what I carried at work before putting the uniform back on. That space mattered in ways my mother never acknowledged, because she never needed it the way I did. To her, it was an asset, something that could be reassigned when priorities shifted. When she said Ryan needed the room, she framed it as logic, not loss. She said he needed quiet. She said he needed focus. She said I worked odd hours anyway and could sleep anywhere. What she didn't say was that taking my room removed the last boundary I had left. Space is power, especially in a house where everyone knows who belongs where. Losing that room meant losing the ability to control even the smallest part of my environment. The basement was closer to the machines, closer to the noise, closer to being interrupted. It made me accessible in a way that felt intentional. If someone needed something, they didn't have to knock. They just came down. Ryan's new setup upstairs grew quickly. The desk I once used to decompress after shifts now held his equipment. The chair I had saved for sat beneath him as he adjusted angles and lighting. My mother watched with satisfaction, commenting on how professional it looked. She talked about his future as if it had already arrived. Meanwhile, my belongings were reduced to boxes and corners, reminders that my presence was temporary and negotiable. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. In healthcare, we're trained to think about environment because it affects outcomes. Patients recover better in spaces designed for rest. Staff perform better when they have areas to decompress. Stripping someone of their space is a way of stripping their capacity to function. My mother didn't see it that way. She saw a room changing hands. She saw efficiency. She saw a problem solved. Ryan saw opportunity. He saw a door he could close. I saw the final confirmation that my needs ranked last. When I tried to set up a small area in the basement to sleep and change between shifts, it was constantly disrupted. The washer rattled. The dryer buzzed. Someone needed something and called my name from the top of the stairs. There was no separation, no pause between my work and their demands. My mother framed this as convenience. She said it made sense for me to be closer to the laundry. She said it was temporary. Temporary had become her favorite word, a way to justify permanent damage. As the days passed, I felt myself shrinking in that space, adjusting my movements, lowering my expectations. I recognized the pattern because I had seen it in patients who lost control over their environments. They became quieter. They stopped asking. They learned to endure. The difference was that I could leave. That thought surfaced quietly without drama. I could leave. The realization wasn't a plan yet. It was a fact. Space equals power, and I had just been stripped of mine. The house functioned because I made it function. They assumed that would continue regardless of where I slept. They assumed wrong. The night my room became Ryan's studio, the system shifted. They took my space believing it was inconsequential. What they didn't understand was that by removing the last place where I could rest and think, they had removed the last reason for me to stay. The emotional breaking point didn't come with shouting or tears. It arrived quietly, the way real exhaustion does after the body has carried too much for too long. A few days after I was moved into the basement, I worked a stretch of back-to-back night shifts in the ICU. One patient deteriorated fast, the kind of decline you see coming but can't stop. I did everything right. Followed protocol, called for help at the right moment, and still watched the monitors go flat. When my shift ended, the sun was already up, and my head felt hollow, like every thought echoed. I drove home on autopilot, hands tight on the steering wheel, replaying the night the way I always did. All I wanted was sleep, real sleep, the kind that lets your nervous system reset. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was loud. Music thumped from upstairs. Laughter carried through the open window. I walked inside and froze at the top of the basement stairs. My old room door was wide open, light spilling out into the hall. Ryan's voice floated down as he tested audio levels, talking to himself like an audience was already listening. I went upstairs without thinking, drawn by muscle memory more than intention. Inside, the room barely resembled the space I'd left. My bed was gone. My shelves were empty. The desk had been rotated to face the wall ring light mounted above it, camera perched like an eye. The ergonomic chair I bought after months of back pain sat beneath him. For a second, my brain didn't catch up. Then I asked the question that came out of my mouth before I could soften it. "Where's my bed?" Ryan didn't turn around. He adjusted a knob and said, "Mom moved it out." We needed the space. My chest tightened. "Where is it?" I asked again. He shrugged. "Basement, I think. Or storage." I walked into the kitchen and found my mother at the sink, rinsing dishes like it was any other morning. "Where's my bed?" I said. She sighed like I was interrupting something trivial. "Ryan needed room to work," she said. "You can sleep downstairs. You said you were fine." I stared at her, the words from the other night echoing. "You'll be fine." I thought about the mattress on concrete, the flickering light, the noise that never stopped. I thought about the patient I'd lost hours earlier. "I worked all night," I said. "I need sleep." She finally looked at me, annoyance flickering across her face. "You always say that," she replied. "You're young. You can handle it." Something in me went very still. It wasn't anger. It was the sudden absence of hope that explaining myself would ever matter. For years, I'd tried to translate my exhaustion into language she could understand. I'd softened it, minimized it, joked about it. Standing there, I realized she wasn't missing the point. She was choosing to ignore it. I went back downstairs and found my bed, shoved against the wall frame, missing mattress, bent slightly from being moved. The chair I used to sit in after work was gone. The one thing I'd invested in for my own body had been repurposed without a second thought. I sat on the mattress and felt the weight of everything I'd been holding settle in my chest. In healthcare, there's a moment when you realize a patient is crashing. The signs are subtle at first, easy to dismiss if you want to believe everything is fine. Then suddenly it's obvious and you know you're past the point of prevention. That's what this felt like. The bed, the chair, the room. They weren't the problem, they were the symptoms. I wasn't being overlooked. I was being consumed. And the worst part was that they believed I would continue to accept it. I lay down, fully clothed, lights on noise echoing through the basement, and stared at the ceiling. I didn't sleep. I didn't cry. I just acknowledged the truth I'd been avoiding. If I stayed, nothing would change. If I stayed, this would be my life. The breaking point wasn't dramatic. It was clinical, a diagnosis made too late to ignore. The sentence that sealed everything wasn't shouted, and it wasn't cruel in the way people expect cruelty to look. It was delivered the next evening casually while my mother folded laundry at the kitchen table. I had come upstairs to grab water between shifts, careful to stay quiet, still moving like a guest in my own house. She didn't look up when she spoke. "You'll be fine in the basement," she said again, like repetition would turn it into truth. "It's temporary. Ryan needs the space right now." The words landed differently this time. Not because they were new, but because I finally heard what was underneath them. Temporary meant indefinite. Needs meant wants. Fine meant silent. I stood there, glass in my hand, listening to the dryer buzz, watching her fold Ryan's clothes with deliberate care. I thought about how many times I'd accepted that phrasing before. "You'll be fine. You can handle it. It's not that bad." Each sentence was a small dismissal wrapped in reassurance, a way to move me out of the way without appearing unkind. I realized then that she wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to maintain comfort. Hers, Ryan's, the household's. Mine was never part of the calculation. I asked her calmly when I could have my room back. She paused, then shrugged. "When things settle," she said. "When Ryan's more established." Established had no timeline. It floated untethered like all the other promises that had been used to keep me waiting. I asked what that meant for me. She sighed and said I was making a big deal out of nothing. She said I worked so much I was barely home anyway. She said sleeping downstairs made sense. Practical. The same word she always used when my comfort was being traded for someone else's convenience. Ryan wandered in halfway through the conversation earbuds and already half elsewhere. When my mother told him we were just talking about space, he smiled and said he appreciated my flexibility. Flexibility. Another word that sounded positive until you realized it only ever applied in one direction. I looked at both of them and felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because the situation was resolved, but because it was finally clear. There was no misunderstanding to correct, no perfect explanation I could give that would make them reconsider. They knew exactly what they were doing. They just believed I would tolerate it. I went back downstairs without arguing, without defending myself, without pointing out the obvious imbalance. That restraint wasn't weakness. It was recognition. In healthcare, we're taught to stop escalating when a treatment isn't working, to reassess, to change course. Arguing had never changed my position in that house. Explaining had only drained me. Silence, I realized, could be strategic. That night, lying on the mattress with the light flickering overhead, I replayed the conversation not with hurt, but with analysis. My mother's language had shifted over time from asking to telling, from gratitude to expectation. Ryan's presence had shifted from temporary to permanent. My role had shifted from daughter to infrastructure. The sentence, "You'll be fine in the basement," wasn't about where I slept. It was about where I ranked. Hearing it a second time stripped away the last illusion that this was accidental or short-term. They weren't waiting for me to come back upstairs. They were waiting for me to adjust. I didn't adjust. I stayed very still and let the reality settle. By repeating that sentence, my mother had unknowingly given me permission to stop negotiating. She had drawn a clear line. On one side was my compliance. On the other was my self-respect. I didn't know yet what choosing the other side would look like, but I knew I was done pretending the basement was acceptable. The next steps didn't come with emotion or urgency. They came with quiet resolve. In the morning, I would go to work like always. I would care for patients, follow protocols, document outcomes. And somewhere between charting and change of shift, I would begin doing the same for my own life. The shift after that conversation felt different, not heavier, just sharper. I moved through the unit with the same efficiency, checked vitals, adjusted drips, documented everything, but my mind kept returning to the same conclusion. There was nothing left to explain. I had spent years translating my needs into softer language, years trying to make them sound reasonable enough to be heard. It never worked because the system I lived in wasn't built to accommodate me. It was built to rely on me. Realizing that changed how I felt about everything. I stopped framing the basement as a temporary inconvenience and started seeing it as information. It told me exactly where I stood. When people show you how little they value your comfort, believe them. That thought followed me through the night, through the early morning, through the quiet drive home. I didn't feel dramatic. I felt clear. I didn't confront my mother again. I didn't ask Ryan for anything. I moved through the house like a visitor observing patterns I'd helped create. Every request that came my way felt suddenly optional. When my mother asked if I could call the cable company later, I said I was busy. When Ryan complained about the internet lagging, I didn't move. I noticed how surprised they looked, how unused they were to any delay in my response. The world didn't end. The house didn't collapse. Things simply remained unresolved. That was new. Down in the basement, I opened my laptop and started doing what I did best at work. I assessed. I gathered data. I listed variables. Income, expenses, what was mine, what wasn't. I pulled up my bank statements and scrolled through months of charges I'd stopped noticing because they were familiar. Utilities, subscriptions, transfers. Each line told the same story. I wasn't just contributing. I was sustaining. I thought about how often my mother said we were all struggling, how often she lumped us together as if the burden were evenly shared. The numbers didn't support that narrative. Neither did my exhaustion. Seeing it laid out made something click. This wasn't about fairness. It was about dependency. They depended on me not just financially but emotionally and logistically, and they depended on my silence most of all. That night, instead of lying awake replaying conversations, I opened a rental site. It felt almost clinical, like researching a treatment plan. I filtered by distance from the hospital, studio, Maximum rent. I didn't let myself get excited. I told myself I was just looking, gathering information. The listings blurred together at first, overpriced boxes with bad lighting and worse layouts. Then one caught my eye. A small studio near a bus line close enough to work that I wouldn't dread the commute after night shifts. Hardwood floors, one window, a corner that could hold a desk, nothing fancy, just space. My own space. I checked the price twice. It was high, but not impossible, especially when I considered what would happen if I stopped covering everyone else's expenses. That thought didn't make me feel guilty. It made me feel steady. I wasn't planning an escape in a rush. I was preparing. The difference mattered. In healthcare, impulsive decisions create emergencies. Planned ones prevent them. Over the next few days, I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I started moving my life quietly. Important documents went into my backpack instead of staying in drawers. My external hard drive disappeared from the basement shelf. I told my mother I was decluttering when she noticed boxes moving. It wasn't a lie. I was removing what mattered. Each small action reinforced the same truth. I had options. The basement wasn't a prison. It was a signal. I noticed how my mother continued to talk as if nothing had changed, how Ryan settled deeper into my old room, confident the arrangement was permanent. They mistook my quiet for acceptance. It was the same mistake they'd always made. The difference now was that I wasn't absorbing the cost anymore. I was redirecting my energy toward myself. The realization wasn't emotional, it was practical. Staying meant nothing would change. Leaving meant everything would. For the first time in years, the choice felt like mine. Once the idea of leaving existed, it stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling necessary. I approached it the same way I approached complex cases at work, slowly and deliberately, making sure every step made sense before moving on to the next. I didn't fantasize about escape. I calculated it. I opened my notes app and wrote down what I earned in an average month, then what actually stayed in my account after everything that quietly flowed out. Rent to my mother, utilities, subscriptions, groceries, rides, emergencies that weren't really emergencies. When I totaled it, my stomach tightened. The number was higher than I expected, not because I didn't know I was contributing, but because I had never allowed myself to see it as a whole. I added a second column labeled "If I Leave." I subtracted everything that wasn't truly mine. The difference was immediate and undeniable. I wasn't scraping by. I was being drained. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me focused. I checked rental listings again during my break at work, scrolling between patient checks, noting addresses and prices. I filtered for quiet neighborhoods, places where the sound of machines wouldn't follow me home. I imagined walking into a space that didn't require explanation. Somewhere I could sleep during the day without being told I could handle it. The studio near the bus line stayed at the top of my list. I scheduled a viewing under the excuse of an appointment on my day off. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell Ryan. I didn't need permission. The morning of the viewing, I left the house early, my backpack heavier than usual with pay stubs, ID, and a folder I'd assembled like I was preparing for a serious exam. The landlord was an older woman with a practical demeanor. She showed me the space without embellishment, pointing out the basics, the rules, the quiet hours. When she asked what I did for work, I said I was a nurse. She nodded like that explained everything. There was relief in that interaction, in being seen without being minimized. I stood in the empty studio and pictured my bed against the wall, my desk by the window, my shoes lined up without someone else tripping over them. It wasn't luxurious. It was sufficient. And for the first time, sufficient felt like abundance. We sat at the small counter while she went over the lease. The numbers were clear. First month, deposit, utilities separate. No surprises. My hand hesitated when she slid the paper toward me, not because I was unsure, but because this was the first decision I'd made in years that wasn't shaped by someone else's needs. I signed. I transferred the funds. The confirmation email hit my inbox before I left the building. On the bus ride home, I kept touching the new key in my pocket, grounding myself in its weight. Back at the house, nothing looked different. Ryan was in my old room, door closed, music playing. My mother was on the couch scrolling, complaining about prices going up. No one asked where I'd been. No one noticed the shift. That invisibility, which had once hurt, now worked in my favor. I started the withdrawal quietly. I changed passwords on accounts that were in my name. I removed my card from auto payments. I stopped answering every request immediately. When my mother asked if I could pick something up later, I said I was busy. When Ryan called for help with his setup, I said I'd look at it another time. Each small refusal felt strange and then normal. Behind the scenes, I moved pieces of my life out of that house. Clothes I didn't need went into a duffel bag. Important items disappeared into my car trunk. I told myself I would announce it when everything was ready. That was the rule I set. No half measures, no pleading. The basement had taught me what happened when my comfort was negotiable. My exit would not be. By the time the move date was set, my fear had transformed into something steadier. I wasn't running away. I was stepping out of a system that only functioned because I sacrificed myself to keep it stable. And once that decision was made, there was no going back. The hardest part wasn't signing the lease or moving money around. It was learning how to act normal while everything underneath quietly shifted. I still went to work. I still came home in scrubs knotted when my mother spoke past Ryan in the hallway without confrontation. On the surface, I looked compliant. Inside, I was detaching. That distance changed how I heard things. When my mother complained about bills, I no longer felt the reflex to solve it. When Ryan talked about needing upgrades or better equipment, his words floated past me without sticking. It was like turning down the volume on a sound that had been constant for years. I noticed how often they assumed my presence meant availability. My mother asked me to add groceries to my list like she always had. I told her I'd already bought what I needed. Ryan asked if I could reset the router later. I said I had an early shift and went downstairs. Each moment created a small ripple of confusion. They weren't angry yet. They were unsettled. That was new. They were used to resistance turning into compliance after a little pressure. This time it didn't. At night, after everyone went to bed, I made quiet trips to my car, carrying bags and boxes one at a time. The house creaked in familiar ways, but I moved carefully, listening, aware of how much of my life I was removing without ceremony. In the studio, I stacked boxes against the wall and sat on the floor exhausted but calmer than I'd felt in years. The silence was real. No one called my name. No machine hummed beneath me. I could breathe without waiting for the next request. I didn't tell myself I deserved it. I told myself it was necessary. Back at the house, my mother started to sense the change. She commented on how little I was around. She asked if I was tired. I said work had been busy. It wasn't a lie. It was just incomplete. Ryan barely noticed until the internet lagged one night and I didn't come running. He shouted my name once, then again. When I didn't respond, he stomped down the stairs and stood at the basement door, irritated. "Are you coming?" he asked. I looked at him and said I was in the middle of something. He stared like the concept was foreign. Eventually, he went back upstairs. I heard him complaining to my mother. She said I was probably tired. The explanation worked for now. The night before my move, I slept in the basement for the last time. The mattress felt thinner than ever. The light flickered. The familiar sounds echoed through the walls. I lay there and thought about how many nights I'd convinced myself this was manageable, how many times I'd shrunk my needs to fit the space I was given. That night, it didn't feel like endurance. It felt like closure. I set my alarm and packed the last of my essentials. In the morning, I would go to work like usual. Then I would come back with a truck. I didn't know how my mother would react when it became real. I didn't know if Ryan would be angry or dismissive, or suddenly afraid. What I knew was that the system they relied on was about to fail, not because I wanted revenge, but because I had finally removed myself from it. That distinction mattered to me. I wasn't leaving to teach them a lesson. I was leaving because staying meant disappearing. And for the first time, choosing myself didn't feel selfish. It felt overdue. Saturday arrived without ceremony. I woke before my alarm, the house still quiet, and lay there for a moment listening to sounds I had memorized over years. The hum of the refrigerator upstairs, the faint creak of pipes, the distant traffic starting to build. This was the last morning those sounds would belong to me. I got dressed, packed the final bag, and went upstairs to make coffee like nothing was different. My mother sat at the table scrolling through her phone, complaining under her breath about prices going up. Ryan's door was closed. No one asked where I was going. That more than anything confirmed I was making the right choice. I finished my shift at the hospital by early afternoon, exhaustion settling in the familiar way, but this time it was layered with anticipation. When I drove back, the moving truck was already parked on the street, the orange logo bright against the quiet block. I sat in the car for a second, hands on the wheel, breathing through the moment. Then I got out. The sound of the truck door closing finally drew my mother to the window. She opened the front door slowly, confusion written across her face. "What's this?" she asked. "I'm moving," I said simply. For a beat, she laughed a short, disbelieving sound. "You're being dramatic," she said. "About a room?" Ryan appeared behind her, eyes flicking from the truck to me. "You can't be serious," he said. "Where would you even go?" I didn't argue. I carried the first box past them and into the truck. My mother followed me onto the porch, her voice rising. "You can't just leave. We need you here." The word need landed exactly where I expected it to. I kept moving. Inside the house, everything felt strangely small. I went to the basement and started loading the mattress, the duffel bags, the boxes I had already prepared. Ryan stood at the top of the stairs, arms crossed, muttering about how inconvenient this was. When he realized I was actually taking things, his tone shifted. "You're overreacting," he said. "Mom didn't mean anything by it." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized how comfortable he was with the arrangement as long as it benefited him. "You didn't need to mean anything by it," I replied. "You just needed me to stay." My mother hovered nearby, oscillating between anger and panic. "You know how expensive everything is," she said. "We can't afford this without you." There it was, the truth stripped of all softness. I stopped and faced her. "That's exactly why I'm leaving," I said. "Because you never thought about what it cost me." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. I continued loading the truck. Halfway through, I went into the kitchen, took a sheet of paper, and sat at the table. I wrote the numbers carefully line by line. Rent, utilities, internet, phone plan, subscriptions, groceries, Ubers, Ryan's equipment. The total sat at the bottom like a diagnosis. I taped it to the refrigerator with a magnet. My mother stared at it, her face draining of color. "That's exaggerated," she said weakly. "It's all right there," I replied. "You can check." Ryan looked uncomfortable for the first time. "You didn't have to do all that he said." "No," I answered. "I didn't. But I did. And it stops now." I loaded the last box, closed the truck, and turned to them. My mother's voice dropped. "You'll come back," she said. "You always do." I shook my head. "If I come back, I said it won't be like this." I climbed into the truck and pulled away. In the side mirror, I saw them standing on the porch, smaller than they had ever seemed. For a moment, guilt flickered. Then I pictured the studio, the quiet, the key in my pocket. I kept driving. That first night in the studio felt unreal in the quietest way possible. I unloaded what I could with sore arms, stacked boxes along the wall, and left the rest for morning. The place smelled faintly of cleaning solution and fresh paint, neutral and untouched. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, eating a simple dinner from a paper container, listening to nothing but the hum of the refrigerator. No footsteps overhead. No one calling my name. No machines rattling beneath me. The silence wasn't lonely. It was restorative. My phone buzzed a few times, face down on the counter. I didn't look at it right away. For years, that buzz had been a command. Tonight, it was just a sound. When I finally checked, the messages were exactly what I expected. My mother asking where I was, telling me we needed to talk. Ryan saying I was being unfair, that I'd left them in a bind. I didn't respond. I showered, lay down on the mattress on the floor, and slept harder than I had in months. The next morning, I woke to light coming through the window, real daylight, not the artificial flicker of the basement bulb. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was, and then the realization settled in. I was alone. On purpose. My phone started vibrating again while I made coffee. This time I read the messages. My mother's tone had shifted. She said they couldn't log into several accounts. She said the internet bill was due and higher than she thought. She said she didn't understand why the heat wasn't working properly. Ryan's messages were sharper. He accused me of cutting them off. He asked if I'd done it on purpose. He said his stream had been ruined. I stared at the screen, feeling the old reflex flare and then fade. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I had simply stopped managing it. There was a difference. My phone rang. My mother's name filled the screen. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail. Then it rang again. I set the phone down and finished my coffee. Less than 24 hours after telling me I'd be fine in the basement, they were unraveling. Not because I'd attacked them, but because I wasn't there to absorb the consequences anymore. The irony didn't escape me. I went to work, focused on patients' documented care, moved through the day with a steadiness that surprised me. When I got home, the missed calls had multiplied. Voicemails piled up. My mother's voice swung between frustration and fear. She said they were overdrawn. She said she hadn't realized how much was in my name. She said things were getting cold. Ryan left messages complaining about Wi-Fi and money in the same breath as if they were equally urgent. For the first time, their emergencies stayed theirs. That evening, I finally answered. Not because I felt guilty, but because I felt ready. My mother sounded exhausted, her words tumbling over each other. "We don't know what to do," she said. "We can't afford this without you." I took a breath. "I'm not moving back," I said calmly. Silence, then anger, then pleading. Ryan jumped in, accusing me of punishing them. I let him talk himself out. When he finished, I said I would help once on my terms. That changed the tone immediately. I laid out conditions the way I would outline a plan at work. I would cover the immediate issue so no one was in danger. After that, I was off their bills completely. We would sit down and go through every dollar coming in and going out. No more assumptions, no more secrets. Ryan would get a real job, not a plan, not an idea, an actual paycheck. My mother protested. Ryan scoffed. I stayed quiet until they ran out of arguments. Finally, my mother agreed, voice small. I handled the immediate fix paid directly and set a time to meet. When I hung up, my hands were steady. The help I offered didn't erase the boundary. It reinforced it. That night, sitting in my studio with boxes still unpacked, I realized something important. They weren't begging me back because they missed me. They were begging because they finally felt what my absence meant. And for the first time, that wasn't my problem to fix alone. Going back to the house after I'd left felt different from the moment I stepped onto the block. It no longer felt like home. It felt like a place I used to manage. I parked a few houses down, sat in the car for a second, and noticed how calm my body felt. No tight chest, no rehearsed explanations, just readiness. Inside, the air was warmer than before, but heavier somehow, like the house itself was aware it was being evaluated. My mother sat at the kitchen table with a stack of unopened bills, her shoulders slumped. Ryan hovered near the counter, arms crossed, eyes darting between me and the papers. I didn't comment on the mess. I opened my laptop and set it on the table. "We're doing this step by step," I said. "Not to argue, to see reality." My mother bristled, then nodded. We started with income, her hours, her rate, the variability she always complained about but never quantified. I typed it in. Then expenses, mortgage, utilities, phone, internet, minimum payments, subscriptions. When we hit anything that used to be in my name, I marked it clearly. Formerly me, not anymore. The words sat there neutral and immovable. Ryan shifted uncomfortably when his spending came up. Equipment, software, small purchases that added up when listed out. He tried to minimize it, saying it wasn't much. I didn't argue. I let the numbers speak. When it was his turn to list income, he shrugged. "I don't really have any," he said. "I'm trying to build something." I met his eyes. "That's not income," I said calmly. "That's a hobby." My mother opened her mouth to defend him, then stopped when she saw the gap on the screen. The math didn't care about intentions. It cared about totals. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space. Then I outlined the conditions again, slower this time. I would not be on any shared accounts. I would not be the emergency fund. If they needed advice, I would give it. If they needed money, the answer would be no. Ryan needed a job. Any job. A paycheck by the end of the month. A portion of it would go toward the house. My mother would adjust spending to what she actually earned, not what she assumed I'd cover. There were protests. There was frustration. There was the familiar attempt to frame me as harsh. I didn't take the bait. "I'm not punishing you," I said. "I'm stepping out of a role you never asked me to leave." That landed differently. My mother looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, not frantic, just resigned. She nodded. "We'll try," she said. I packed up my laptop and stood. The meeting was over. As I left, I noticed the paper I'd taped to the fridge weeks earlier was still there, edges curled. No one had taken it down. Back at the studio, my life settled into a rhythm that felt almost boring. Work, home, quiet dinners, sleep that actually worked. My phone rang less. When it did, it wasn't an emergency disguised as a question. Weeks passed. Ryan got a job at a warehouse across town. He complained at first, then stopped. My mother adjusted cut subscriptions, stopped ordering takeout. One evening, she slid an envelope across the table when I came for dinner. Inside was a small check. Not much, but it wasn't about the amount. It was acknowledgement. I didn't celebrate. I didn't lecture. I accepted it and moved on. The biggest change wasn't financial. It was how they treated my time. No more midnight calls. No more assumptions. The line held because I held it. Sitting alone in my studio later that night, I thought about the basement, about how certain my mother had been that I'd be fine. In a way, she was right. I was fine, just not in the way she meant. Time has a way of proving which changes are real and which are just reactions to crisis. The weeks after that meeting were quiet, not because everything was fixed, but because the old pattern no longer had permission to operate. I noticed it in small, ordinary moments. My phone would ring, and instead of my heart jumping, it stayed steady. Sometimes I answered, sometimes I didn't, and the world didn't collapse either way. When my mother called now, she asked how I was before mentioning anything else. When Ryan texted, it was usually to say he'd picked up an extra shift or to complain about how tired he was, which I listened to without offering solutions. He was learning slowly what it felt like to carry his own weight. At work, I felt different too. Without the constant background anxiety of home, my focus sharpened. I wasn't rushing through shifts with half my energy reserved for whatever crisis awaited me afterward. I noticed details more clearly. I spoke up more confidently. I signed up for a training I'd been postponing for years because I finally believed my time belonged to me. At home, my studio started to look like a real place. I hung a couple of prints, bought a small rug, positioned my bed so the morning light hit it just right. None of it was expensive. All of it felt intentional. The absence of chaos was the luxury. When I visited my mother's house, it felt smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but emotionally. The energy had shifted. There was less noise, fewer impulsive purchases, fewer assumptions. Ryan came home tired from work and went straight to his room without an audience. My mother talked more about budgeting than complaining. The house was learning how to function without me holding everything together. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. One evening after dinner, my mother lingered by the door as I was leaving. She looked at me and said quietly, "I didn't realize how much you were doing." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't complete. But it was honest. I nodded and said, "I know." That was enough. The guilt I'd carried for so long didn't vanish overnight, but it loosened its grip. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head, stopped wondering if I'd overreacted. The evidence was all around me. When I left, they struggled. When they struggled, they adapted. That adaptation never would have happened if I'd stayed. I thought about how many years I'd believed love meant endurance. How many times I'd told myself that being needed was the same as being valued. Sitting in my quiet studio, I understood the difference. Being needed made me useful. Being valued made me free. The basement had been the clearest message my family ever gave me, even if they hadn't intended it that way. It showed me exactly how expendable my comfort was in their calculations. Walking away didn't make me heartless. It made me honest. The justice in all of it wasn't loud or public. There was no dramatic apology, no moment where everything snapped into place. The justice was structural. The system that relied on my sacrifice collapsed, and in its place, a more balanced one emerged. That kind of justice doesn't feel like revenge. It feels like relief. As the months passed, my life grew smaller in the best way. Fewer obligations, fewer emergencies, more space to breathe. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped justifying my boundaries. I let them exist. Looking back now, the sentence "you'll be fine in the basement" feels almost ironic. I was fine, just not by shrinking. I was fine because I finally stepped out of the basement role altogether. 6 months later, the distance between who I was in that basement and who I'd become was impossible to ignore. It showed up in my body first. I slept through the night without jolting awake, heart racing, already bracing for someone else's problem. My shoulders, which had lived in a permanent state of tension, slowly relaxed. Even my coworkers noticed. One of the doctors I worked with commented that I seemed lighter, more present. I laughed it off, but I knew exactly why. For the first time in my adult life, my nervous system wasn't on constant standby. My days followed a rhythm that belonged to me. Work-home quiet meals, occasional dinners with friends I'd neglected for years. I stopped apologizing for being unavailable. When I said I couldn't help, I didn't add explanations or excuses. I simply meant it, and the world adjusted. My mother still struggled at times, but she no longer expected me to swoop in. When she called, it was to talk, not to unload. When Ryan complained about work, he complained like someone who actually had a job to be tired from. He didn't ask me to fix things anymore. He asked questions, advice questions, the kind you can answer without sacrificing yourself. The difference mattered. I thought a lot about justice during that time, not the kind you see in movies, but the kind that actually changes behavior. There was no courtroom, no verdict, no grand apology. The justice came from consequences being allowed to exist. When I removed myself, the imbalance became visible. When it became visible, it had to be addressed. That was the part I'd been preventing all along. By staying, by paying, by fixing, I had shielded them from reality. Leaving didn't punish them. It introduced them to it. One evening, my mother called and asked if I wanted to come by for dinner. I said yes. When I walked into the house, I noticed the thermostat set lower, the lights turned off in rooms no one was using, the absence of delivery bags piled by the door. Small things, but telling. At the table, she handed me another envelope. This one had a little more in it than the last. I know it's not everything she said, almost defensively, but I want you to know I'm trying. I looked at her and nodded. I see that I said. And I did. The money wasn't repayment. It was recognition. Ryan showed up late, still in his work clothes, tired and quiet. Halfway through the meal, he mentioned he'd been promoted to a different shift. Not proudly, not dramatically, just stating a fact. It pays a little more, he said. I smiled and told him congratulations. He looked surprised, then pleased. That moment mattered more than any argument we'd ever had. It wasn't about me being right. It was about him growing up. Driving back to my studio that night, I passed the turn that would have taken me back to the basement. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt gratitude, oddly enough. That moment had forced a reckoning I never would have chosen for myself. Sometimes the most painful displacement is what finally moves you into your own life. Sitting in my studio, I looked around at the simple things I'd built. A desk by the window, a plant I remembered to water, a calendar filled with plans that weren't emergencies. I thought about the question I'd avoided for years. What would actually happen if I stopped fixing everything? The answer turned out to be simpler than I imagined. Things broke. Then they adapted, and I finally got to live. The strangest part was how ordinary everything became once the chaos faded. I had expected some dramatic aftershock moment where I'd regret leaving or feel the pull to go back and fix things one last time. That moment never came. Instead, life settled into a steady rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar in its calm. I woke up, went to work, came home, cooked simple meals, and rested without bracing for interruption. The absence of constant urgency created space for thoughts I hadn't had room for before. I started thinking about what I wanted beyond survival. Not what was practical for the family, not what kept everyone afloat, but what actually mattered to me. At work, I applied for a specialized training program I'd quietly wanted for years but never pursued because it required time and focus I didn't think I was allowed to take. When I was accepted, I didn't tell my mother right away. Not out of secrecy, but because I no longer needed permission or validation to move forward. I told her later casually over dinner. She smiled a little uncertain and said she was proud of me. The words landed differently now. They weren't tied to what I provided, they were just words. Ryan changed too in ways that were subtle but real. He stopped talking about big plans that would change everything overnight. He talked about shifts, schedules, coworkers who annoyed him. He complained about sore feet and early mornings. Normal things. When he asked for advice, he listened. When I said I didn't know, he figured it out himself. The dependency that had defined our relationship slowly dissolved into something more balanced. We weren't close in the way people imagine siblings should be, but we were honest, and that was new. My mother still slipped into old habits sometimes. She'd sigh dramatically about money or stress waiting to see if I'd jump in. When I didn't, she adjusted often, catching herself mid-sentence. I could see the effort it took. That effort was the proof that the boundary was real. I realized then that boundaries don't work because you explain them perfectly. They work because you enforce them consistently, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then. One afternoon, while sorting through paperwork in my studio, I found an old notebook from the time I'd first moved into the basement. Inside were half-written lists, reminders, things I meant to do for other people, bills to check, calls to make, problems to solve. I flipped through it slowly and felt a wave of recognition. That notebook represented a version of myself who believed her worth was measured by how much she could carry. I closed it and threw it away without ceremony. There was no need to keep evidence of a role I no longer played. Looking back, the justice in all of this wasn't that my family struggled without me. It was that they learned to function without exploiting me, and that I learned to stop equating love with sacrifice. The basement, the bills, the silence after I left, all of it pointed to the same truth. When you remove yourself from a system that relies on your self-erasure, the system either adapts or fails. Mine adapted. And so did I. I no longer felt the need to tell this story as a warning or a lesson. I told it because it was proof that walking away doesn't always destroy families. Sometimes it forces them to grow, and sometimes it saves the person who was disappearing inside them. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in any part of it, the exhaustion, the quiet resentment, the belief that everything will fall apart if you stop holding it together, I want you to know something. You are not selfish for wanting space. You are not cruel for stepping back, and you are not responsible for managing the consequences of other people's choices. The day I stopped fixing everything was the day my life finally became my own. What surprised me most, looking back, was how little drama there actually was once the dust settled. For years, I had imagined that if I ever truly stepped away, it would end in permanent estrangement, slammed doors, unforgivable words. That fear had kept me compliant longer than anything else. The reality was quieter and in some ways more uncomfortable for everyone involved, without me absorbing the pressure my family had to sit with their own choices. There was no villain to point at, no dramatic story where I was the unreasonable one who abandoned them. There was just the math of life, the bills that still arrived, the work that still needed doing, and the absence of my automatic yes. My mother struggled most with that absence. Not because she didn't care about me, but because she had built her sense of stability around my reliability. When that disappeared, she was forced to confront how much she had leaned without noticing. We didn't have long emotional conversations about it. That wasn't our style. Instead, change showed up in behavior. She stopped assuming I'd be available. She asked instead of told. Sometimes she caught herself mid-sentence and corrected course, which told me more than any apology could. Ryan's adjustment was more visible. The first few weeks of working full-time drained him in ways he wasn't prepared for. He complained loudly at first, then less so. The complaints shifted from unfairness to fatigue, from entitlement to frustration. Those were normal growing pains, the kind I'd been protected from expressing because I'd always had to be the steady one. Watching him go through that process didn't make me feel superior. It made me feel relieved. He was finally learning lessons I had learned far too early. Our relationship changed because the imbalance was gone. We weren't close, but we were no longer stuck in the roles of taker and giver. That alone was progress. In my own life, the absence of constant crisis allowed space for reflection I'd never had before. I realized how much of my identity had been shaped by being needed. Without that, I had to answer a new question. Who am I when no one is pulling at me? The answer didn't arrive all at once. It emerged in small choices, saying no to extra shifts I didn't need, taking a weekend to rest without justification, spending money on things that served only me. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was transformative. I stopped feeling like my life was something happening around me. It became something I actively participated in. One evening, months after I moved out, my mother called just to talk. No request, no crisis. We spoke about mundane things, the weather, a neighbor, a show she'd been watching. Before hanging up, she said almost thoughtfully, "I didn't realize how much pressure I put on you." I thanked her and didn't push for more. That acknowledgement, imperfect as it was enough. It wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about recognizing it so it didn't repeat. I understood then that healing didn't require my family to become different people. It required me to become a different version of myself, one who didn't step in automatically, one who didn't confuse endurance with love, one who trusted that other adults could handle their own lives even if it was messy. The justice in this story isn't that anyone was punished. It's that everyone was returned to their proper responsibility. My mother learned to manage within her means. Ryan learned to earn, and I learned to live without shrinking. The basement, once a symbol of my erasure, became the moment my life turned upright. Not because I endured it, but because I refused to stay there. The final shift happened so quietly, I almost missed it. It wasn't in my family or my work, but in the way I spoke to myself. For years, my inner voice had sounded like my mother's on her tired days, pragmatic, dismissive, urging me to endure a little longer. "You'll be fine. You can handle it. Other people need you more right now." Living alone gave me enough silence to hear that voice clearly and decide whether it deserved authority. One evening after a long shift, I came home and sat at my desk by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. I realized I wasn't bracing for anything. No call, no text, no problem waiting to be solved. The quiet didn't feel empty. It felt complete. I thought about how much of my life I'd spent preparing for impact, storing energy for crises that weren't mine. That vigilance had once kept things running. It had also kept me from growing. Without it, I felt awkward at first, like someone learning how to use muscles they'd never been allowed to move. I made mistakes. I overrested. I underestimated how tired I actually was. I learned. At work, I noticed a change in how colleagues interacted with me. I spoke up sooner. I delegated more. I trusted others to handle what wasn't mine to fix. Those habits once learned at home had followed me everywhere. Undoing them took time, but it worked. I was no longer the invisible backbone holding everything together. I was a professional with limits, a person with preferences, a woman with a life that didn't revolve around anticipation. I started mentoring a new nurse on the unit, someone bright and capable who reminded me of myself years earlier. One night, after a particularly rough shift, she apologized for needing help. I looked at her and heard my old voice trying to surface. Instead, I said, "Asking for help doesn't make you weak. It makes the system safer." The words surprised me with their certainty. I realized then that the lesson I'd learned at home had changed how I showed up everywhere else. I no longer believed that suffering quietly was a virtue. I believed in structure, in balance, in shared responsibility. My family continued adjusting in their own imperfect way. There were still moments of tension, occasional slips into old language, brief flare-ups when money was tight or stress ran high. The difference was that none of it pulled me back into the basement role. I listened. I empathized. I didn't intervene unless it was appropriate, and most of the time, it wasn't. Watching them navigate their own lives without leaning on me felt strange at first, then right. It wasn't cold, it was respectful. I understood something then that I wish I'd learned earlier. Love that requires you to disappear isn't love, it's dependence. Real connection allows space for everyone to exist fully. On a quiet Sunday morning, I cleaned my studio, folded laundry, watered the plant by the window, and thought about how ordinary my life had become. That ordinariness was the reward. No one was shoving me aside. No one was deciding where I belonged. I chose. The memory of the basement no longer stung. It had transformed into a reference point, a line I would never cross again. If someone told me I'd be fine by sacrificing myself, I would know better. I would know what fine actually costs. The story didn't end with reconciliation or triumph. It ended with stability, with a life that fit me, with the quiet confidence that if I ever heard those words again, "You'll be fine," I'd be able to smile and answer honestly, "I am, just not like that anymore, like that." The story people expect after something like this usually ends with a confrontation, a tearful apology, or a moment where everyone finally says the right words. Mine didn't. It ended with something far less cinematic and far more powerful. It ended with consistency. Months passed, then a year. The emergency calls never returned. The late-night demands didn't creep back in. The assumption that I would step in, pay up, smooth things over, quietly endure stayed where it belonged in the past. My life didn't become perfect. It became honest. Some days were still hard. Healthcare doesn't stop being heavy just because your home life improves. I still lost patience. I still came home tired. The difference was that the tiredness belonged to the work itself, not to the unpaid labor waiting for me afterward. When I closed my door at night, it stayed closed. That boundary, once unimaginable, became normal. My relationship with my mother settled into something quieter and more realistic. We spoke regularly, but not constantly. She no longer framed her stress as my responsibility. When money was tight, she adjusted. When Ryan struggled, he handled it. I stopped being the shock absorber between them and reality. That shift didn't make me less loving. It made me present in a way I'd never been before. Our conversations weren't weighed down by resentment or obligation. They were simpler, shorter, real. Ryan eventually admitted something one evening over dinner. He said he hadn't realized how much I'd been covering until it stopped. He didn't say thank you the way people imagine gratitude should sound. He said it awkwardly, almost defensively. But he said it. That was enough. He was no longer a project I had to manage. He was an adult learning how to live. That had never been my job. In my own space, life continued to expand in small, deliberate ways. I finished the training I'd signed up for. I moved into a role that challenged me without draining me. I built routines that protected my energy instead of consuming it. I learned how to rest without guilt. That took longer than anything else. Rest had always felt earned only after sacrifice. Now it felt deserved simply because I existed. Sometimes late at night, I thought back to the basement, to the certainty in my mother's voice when she said I'd be fine down there. I understood now that she wasn't lying. She was projecting. Fine to her meant functional, quiet, adaptable. It meant nothing breaking on the surface. It never meant well. I redefined that word for myself. Fine meant sleeping through the night. Fine meant not dreading my own front door. Fine meant choosing where I belonged and not asking permission for it. The justice in this story wasn't about watching anyone suffer. It was about watching a pattern end. It was about refusing to be the invisible support beam in a structure that would never strengthen as long as I held it up. When I stepped away, everyone had to carry their own weight. And when that happened, I finally got to put mine down. If you're hearing this and recognizing pieces of yourself in it, the exhaustion, the quiet compliance, the belief that everything will fall apart without you, I want you to know something clearly. Things might fall apart, and that might be exactly what needs to happen, because what rebuilds afterward has a chance to be fair. The basement wasn't where my life shrank. It was where I stopped shrinking, and walking away from it was the most ordinary, radical act of self-respect I've ever made.